I would like to start, if that's okay with everyone. Let me start by saying good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to one and all. I greet you in the name of peace. To our participants, thank you for joining us today. I hope that we will have a good interaction based on good time management, screen management, and in how we manage it, the chat box. To our panelists, our esteemed guest speakers, thank you for your generosity. You've given us your time, and of course, and your commitment to share your knowledge and insights with all of us today. We really thank you. We really appreciate your commitment to the cause as well. To the team that put the webinar, I'd like to acknowledge Joseph in northern India. People are introducing themselves. Thomas in southern India, Daria in Cyprus, Peter in Spain, Phil in Arusha, Tanzania, and I am Gino Govender, and I'm based in Johannesburg, South Africa. I'm part of this wonderful team, and I will play host, if you like, as moderator for the rest of the series. So after all the months of behind the scenes work, it's a pleasure having you all together for the next hour and a half as we launch the webinar series. And the first one is titled Speaking of Violence, right? And mapping the terrain. Folks, just a little bit of context and background. From personal life experience, we all know only too well that building something beautiful, anything sustainable, from a small garden to a good relationship, to a family, a reputation, a house, a community, an organization, a society, and ultimately a civilization is long, hard, painstaking work. Yet all of this wonderful hard work can easily be destroyed in a second. As they say, it's difficult to build, but easy to destroy. We are now in the first quarter, first year, if you like. First year 2025 is the year of the first quarter of the 21st century. So we still have another 75 years to go this century, right? Today, more than ever, uh, we need to make peace with the planet, between countries, between each other. The sentiment, we first need peace, but justice must soon follow to make it a lasting peace, is part of pacifist cultures across the world, and in one form or another have been expressed by various global leaders, such as Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, and of course Mahatma Gandhi, all of who emphasized that peace without justice is incomplete and temporary. They believe that true peace can only be achieved when it is accompanied by justice for all, addressing underlying inequalities and systemic oppression. More than ever today, we need to see how, within social movements, social justice movements, that within our particular sort of sector rests the biggest hope in building just, non-violent futures for all. Social movements, both globally and domestically, combat physical and structural violence by challenging unjust policies and promoting inequality, proving vital in shaping just, peaceful societies through collective action. A global peace movement against militarization and the arms race, as they call it, is essential for fostering a safer, more equitable world. By advocating disarmament and reallocating resources to peace building, it will promote global security through cooperation. To sustain this hope of peace and build the momentum to end violence, the Global Social Movement Center, has organized a series of six 90-minute webinars to deconstruct and understand violence and work on reconstructing pathways towards building just, enduring, and peaceful societies. In the process, we hope that we all will be able to contribute to building a just, sustainable, and peaceful world from below and beyond borders. In today's webinar, we will explore different categories of collective violence and how it has developed over time and understood by social movements. We hope in this discussion, to outline an agenda, if you like, of how over the webinar series, we will explore and understand different facets of organized violence. Together, we hope in the series, and of course, we are confident that we can build the main threads that helps us weave a tapestry away from the horrors of violence, of the few, to one of dignity, peace, and justice for all. In the webinar, we hope to build a safe space, or safe spaces, if you like, for analysis, insights, reflection, sharing, supporting, for education, for collaborating, for building something useful, such as mass awareness and understanding. And we hope to amplify grassroots voices for peace and justice. In this webinar, what we'd like to do is, as part of the opening session, we will have a session with our panelists, a short 15-minute session. Then we'd like to pick up on what the panelists have provided into the room, and hopefully we can have an engagement that would last 55 minutes or so, an engagement between the panelists and the audience, and then in the last 15 minutes we will try to wrap up the seminar. So hopefully that we can we can have a real good interactive, respectful, engaging webinar, right? Even and be able to use the time to the best of our ability. So, dear friends and comrades, before we move to our first panel speaker, let me just update you that we're supposed to have four panelists today. And one of our panelists, an important panelist from Palestine, yesterday was unfortunately held, excuse me, was held by the Jordanian authorities, his passport taken, and today he has been booked for interrogation, right? We've been in touch with him and through the communications thus far. It's we're not sure, he's not sure exactly what the interrogation is all about, but certainly we just hope, and I'm sure with your prayer, he'll be fine, and hopefully, they will release him in time to join us. And if we can't accommodate him today, we'll find another way to have him on one of the other webinars. So I hope, and I'm sure I have your full support, that we pray that he is going to be safe and will be able to join us. What we'd like to do, people, and that is, we'd like to, given the importance of the series, and in particular the focus of this particular webinar, speaking of violence, what I would like us to do as participants, we have altogether 58 participants in the room at the moment. What I would like us to do, and we are proposing that we have a pause and a prayer, if you like, for peace. And we will do this, we'll just take a few seconds, and this basically as a way of all of us in the Zoom room coming together in a solemn way to pause and to think, to reflect, to pray for peace. What I would like to do is, as we start, this is something I learned from my wife. So we try to sit comfortably, hands at ease on your side or on your knees. Close your eyes. Focus on your breathing. Breathe in slowly and focus your thoughts, honoring and remembering someone we know and those in faraway lands whose lives were cut short through violence. We'd also like to honor those who dedicate their lives at the service of humanity. May we start. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. I think in reflecting on the poster with the sparrow on the barbed wire, and if you look at the bigger picture, that is the sparrow has found a safe space in barbed wire that has got particular symbolisms of imprisonment, of keeping people out, of hurting should you cross the line, as it were. But in this picture, we see the sparrow has been able to find a safe space to pause for a while she's probably thinking about, her next move. And I hope that the symbolism of what we've just done helps us to transition from a moments of silence into a kind of a dialogue, a discussion on what is happening around us in the world today. What I'd like us to do, I'd like to hand over to Daria, who will explain a little bit of how we want to run the webinar and how folks could participate while we are listening to our panel speakers and to each other. So Daria, please, would you come in and just explain the proposals around how we want to manage the chat box and what people could do to participate over the next few minutes. Thank you, Daria.
Great. Can you hear me well? Am I audible? Great. Thank you, Gino. My name is Daria, and I'll be behind the screen with the rest of our team listening in and there to support in the chat. Again, welcome everybody. We're very glad to have you here for today's webinar. But before we dive in, a few small housekeeping rules. We encourage you very much to engage with us throughout the session. The chat is open and we'd love to hear from you. For those of you who have already started to tell us where you're joining from, maybe your area of practice or struggle, that's great. Please continue to do so and share your thoughts on the discussion, and feel free to respond to others as well. If you have any questions for our panelists, please do use the Q&A feature so that we can track them more easily. You can also direct questions to a specific panelist if you'd like, and we'll do our best to get to as many as possible. And lastly, this webinar is being recorded and will be available for those who'd like to revisit it or to share it with others. That's it from me. Thank you, and over to you, Gino.
Okay, thank you so much, Daria. I think it's easy. Many of us over the past many years, especially after COVID, we've learned the art of participating in these online webinars and discussions and meetings and so on. So I hope all of this is easy for all of us, right? And we'll try and manage it in the best possible ways. So what we thought in looking at the issue of violence, and there's so much has been written on violence. There's an entire glossary of violence that has been produced by the World Health Organization through their what they call the World Health Assembly. And they've been able to put together a glossary, and I hope we'll share this later with you, from, sort of self-violence, violence to oneself, injuring oneself, killing oneself, like such as suicide, right up to what we have come to know as genocide. And many millions of people across the world over the last many months, especially as a result of what was happening in Palestine, have come to understand what we mean by genocide. So in doing so, what we thought in putting the panel together, we will ask the panel how we understand violence. What does it mean to you? What is the situation in your context now when it comes to violence in its multiple forms? And thirdly, what's your experience being faced with and countering violence in your struggle, right? And to help us navigate this particular question, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Radha Kumar. Professor Kumar is a former Director General of the Delhi Policy Group, where she served from 2010 to 2016, specializing in peace and security in South Asia. She chaired the United Nations University Council from 2016 to 2021 and is currently Vice Chairperson of the Stockholm International Peace and Research Institute. Her work focuses on ethnic conflicts and peace processes from a strongly feminist perspective. She is a writer and activist, first in the Indian women's movement and then with the Bhopal gas survivors, and currently working with democracy groups in India. Her latest book, The Republic Relearned, Renewing Indian Democracy, 1947 to 2024, has been published. And in 2019, she founded the Kodaikanal Gandhi Prize for School Students. She is the co-chair of the Forum for Human Rights in Jammu and Kashmir. Professor Radha Kumar, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the panel, and let me hand over to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Gino, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to all of you in the team for having me on this webinar. I was thinking about various of the points that you made in your introductory remarks, Gino. And, you know, speaking as an Indian, while there are so many forms of violence, in the world on so many different areas. I have found that in my life, I am surrounded by daily instances of extreme physical violence, which ranges from caste discrimination and caste assaults to gender conflicts to self-determination conflicts to communal conflicts, that is, religious conflicts, which have been rising very sharply in my country, to the great sorrow of many of us. My experience in countering conflict has been mostly in the women's movement and also in the anti-communal movement, for example, in the 1984 riots against Sikhs. Uh, so I have some experience there. And personally, I have been living for the last 8 years in a small mountaintop where three major communities, Hindus, Christians, and Muslims, live together without any conflict whatsoever. And there is a concerted social effort on the part of all the residents to keep it that way. So I also am struck by the difference there is between the north of India and the south of India when it comes to communal violence. By the way, there's also an enormous difference between the east of India and the west of India when it comes to political violence, which too has been enormously on the rise in the past few years. Now, looking at means of countering violence, one of the questions that has arisen for me time and time again is at what point do non-violent methods of resistance achieve success? As we all know, it can often work best in the early warning phase. As conflicts heat up, it becomes more and more difficult to find non-violent forms of resisting that conflict. And once full-fledged armed conflict breaks out, it's a whole other question of how you look at ways of responding in a non-violent way to that conflict. The second kind of point that has struck me is that when it comes to peace negotiations, um, it's very important to recognize that you should not seek at the outset of the negotiations to settle every issue, including the future governing structure of the new country, because the danger in that is that you reify you give an institutional framework to the conflict that began. This is especially the case in ethnic conflicts. And we've seen it happen, whether we see it in the case of Bosnia or much earlier in the case of Lebanon. Attempts to find an overall settlement don't actually work. The exception to that is the case of occupations. In the case of Palestine, for example, it's very clear that the occupation has to end. Alongside a ceasefire, no ceasefire can possibly hold until the occupation is ended. So that is occupations are a case in themselves. Then finally, thinking about nonviolence itself, I remembered, as you have stressed, Gino, that you cannot have nonviolence without justice, and you cannot have a durable peace without justice. But it's also true that nonviolent movements, as Gandhi always stressed, and as I think Dr. King did as well, truth-telling is an absolutely essential part of nonviolence. Often we mistake in our country the desire to be amenable to everybody. We tend to suppress truth-telling. And that means that you allow the wound to fester, without tackling it at its source and finding a way around it. Obviously, Desmond Tutu's idea of truth and reconciliation was a very important one in that regard. The question again is, of course, timing. Where and at what point can something like that actually take root and actually be effective? So to conclude, I would say that with our ideals, we need to be very aware of the importance of timing on how we proceed, and to consider that in almost every case of negotiations, a ceasefire is not only essential, it must be accompanied by peace building. And it's only when you have managed to create some atmosphere of safety that you can actually work towards lasting solutions.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Radha, for that input. Yeah. And think certainly beyond those headlines, of course, we have many hours of further deliberations on the issue. The one thing that I picked up on is that you spoke about the institutionalization of conflict. And the thing about it is that I can think about South Africa's experience. Even under the leadership of Nelson Mandela, what we tried to do post-apartheid was to create the institutions of dialogue, social dialogue. In other words, build a social democracy. But we'll come back to that. I'd like to pick that up on how you see the institutionalization of conflict merely for the sake of peace. If that's okay with you?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for that input. Let me move on to our next panelist, who is Hassan Taiwo Soweto. Just speaking of South Africa, that is. Hassan, I'm sorry to do this to you again. But Comrade Soweto, as he is widely known, is a socialist activist and a revolutionary with years of experience in class struggle in Nigeria, especially in the fields of student and youth activism, labor struggles, and organizing for social change in Nigeria and, of course, the Africa continent. He is a member of the National Executive Committee of the Democratic Socialist Movement, affiliated to the Committee for the Workers' International. Should I say Fourth International? Okay, never mind. And the National Coordinator of the Education Rights Campaign. He is also the spokesperson of the Youth Rights Campaign and a national youth leader of the Socialist Party of Nigeria. Comrade Soweto played active roles in the mammoth struggle that broke out in Nigeria last year from the 1st to the 10th of August, popularly known as the #End Bad Governance protest. His role in the 10 days protest in Lagos State was essential in keeping the movement together. Note, was essential in keeping the movement together. In the face of provocations and attacks by the police and thugs paid by a Nigerian state to disrupt the process. Comrade Soweto, it is an absolute pleasure having you, I know from the west of Africa, but certainly from Africa, in the panel. Really, thank you for your time. And going back to framing the question, dear comrade, how do you understand it from your perspective? What does it mean for the people of Nigeria? What is the situation in your context now when it comes to violence, and how you experience it in your struggles, as we alluded to in your bio? So let me, without further ado, hand over to you, and in the same way, focus on making your essential heads of arguments, and then I'd like to pick up, and same with the team, we'll pick up anything that emerges out of your heads of arguments, your initial input. Thank you, Comrade Soweto. Over to you.
Yes, thank you, and thanks to everyone at this webinar. I'd like just to quickly make my point. And the first thing I'd like to say is that I think that when discussing violence, that it's important to start the discussion by looking at the structure of society. I think that's the best way for us to be able to approach the issue with more clarity. And we are going to then realize, once we take that step, that our society, whether in the global north or in the global south, is, they are class divided society. They are class societies. There are societies where you have the few rich and then a majority who are poor. And when you look at the structure of this society, when you look at how the state is organized, then it becomes very clear that the state in every country, in every society, is constituted by the exploiting classes in those societies. They become the ruling class in that sense, and they take control of the state. So from that kind of analysis, you then begin to see that when you are talking about violence, the first violence you see in any society is state-organized violence, is the violence of the capitalist state, whether you are talking about Nigeria or you are talking about other parts of the world. The violence is about keeping the rule of the ruling elite, keeping together the condition of their exploitation and rule, and trying to prevent those who might want to challenge their power, that is the working class, the student, the youth, the civil society organizations, and all of that. And when you look at the army, the police, in every capitalist state, their role is simply to act in this manner, to defend the rule, the class rule of the exploiting class. When you also look at the role of the judiciary, you look at the role of the press, everywhere you look at, you just see that these are just different branches of the same state playing different roles, but the whole agenda is the same. And that is why essentially Frederick Engels described the state as essentially an armed body of men. And I think that is what gives us a background to this discussion. Because here in Nigeria, we have had since last year, increased state repression. But when you look at why you have had this increased state repression, it's only because you have a population that has become so fed up with starvation, with hunger, and the people are rising on their feet and they are beginning to fight back and demand answers to certain questions. And the capitalist state is unable to answer those questions. So the best way therefore for the capitalist state is to continue to attack, to kill, to arrest, and all of that. And you find variations of this same thing in almost every country, including in the most developed capitalist countries in the world today, where some of the examples that you see of repression you see in the colonial world are beginning to emerge. So in that sense, violence is state-organized violence. It's violence to keep together the structure of society, the structure of exploitation. And that violence is overwhelming. The tool for it is the army, is the police, is the judiciary, is the press, is morality, is religion, and all of this. So that for those of us, the working class, the poor, the youth, who are victims of this state-organized violence, when we are discussing violence, first and foremost, our attitude can never be from the point of view of morality, because we are constantly assailed by the violence of the ruling elite. People are dying because of poverty, because of inability to access various needs across Africa. And all of this is only to ensure that a certain number of people are able to live a life of luxury. That is an economic violence of its own. So that when we are discussing how to respond, when we are talking about violence as working people, as working class activists, as youth, it's therefore not from the point of view of morality. Rather, it's from the point of view of what strategies are necessary, for the current stage of our struggle, in order to build our struggle, in order to organize the class struggle up to the stage of changing society. So that the question of a non-violent resistance form of struggle, therefore, is for me not something we should approach as a philosophy of acquiescence. Rather, it is a strategical method for the current stage of the struggle. Because the struggle we face in every part of the world is not just a struggle for basic essentials. In almost all parts of the world, the capitalist ruling elite for more than 200 and 300 years have demonstrated that they are incapable of taking society forward. In fact, the arms race we see in the world today, the violence, the wars we see in the world today, the possibility of a climate, of a destruction of the planet, are indications of how, unless the capitalist elite is overthrown, they are likely going to, push society onto the edge of an abyss. All of these are indications of that. So what that means, therefore, is that our struggle is not only just to fight for bread and butter. The working people, the youth all over the world, have the power to also define for ourselves a new kind of society, a new way of running society. But until we are able to get to that stage where we can define that new form of society, we need a method of struggle that can keep us together, that can preserve our strength, that can build our consciousness. And that, for me, is where, the value and benefit of nonviolent resistance comes from. However, struggle in every country gets to a point where the question is posed as to what happens next. How should society, be organized? Who should continue to run society in these different parts of the world? In Sudan, we have had that situation about 2 years ago, and you could see the inability of revolutionaries to provide answers to that, how it has led to the kind of very terrible bloodletting you see happening in that part of Africa today. In many parts of the world, we can give examples of how the inability of revolutionaries, of activists, to be able to provide the appropriate questions, strategical answers rather, to these questions, has actually led society, to the point of peace. And that is why I think, for the purpose of this discussion, we have to clearly recognize that at that point, non-resistance forms of struggle would have to give way to firmer forms of a method of struggle that, that can ensure that the mass anger of the people, their desire for a new society, actually, becomes a reality. And that is where the question of a general strike becomes inevitable at some point. The question of an armed insurrection by the mass of the people in certain countries becomes inevitable at a certain point. The question of the overthrow, of the capitalist state becomes posed. And we just need to look at the French Revolution, or maybe just stay a little bit closer in time and go over to the Russian Revolution of 1917. And you see very clearly that no ruling elite, no ruling class anywhere, gives way without a fight. So that is where, the non-violent forms of resistance, have to find, develop and into a firmer form of resistance that can be able to meet up with the violence of the ruling elite, that can be able to supplant them and take over the running of society. And the purpose of that is to give back to a new world, free from hunger, free from exploitation, free from wars, free from violence, where there is social justice and where everyone can be able to live a prosperous life. That is impossible today because of the way capitalism is structured. And when you look at NATO, see that.
Let me come in. Let me ask you.
Revolution for and that is why
comrade, just hang on. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, please. I say just pause. Pause there. I want to. Yeah. In fact, you've covered quite an important part. I was hoping that you brought in the second half of the webinar into the first when you start racing towards solutions. So hold on to it. Hold on. I think the issue, though, that that even has been raised in the chat box, in that is, the violence that you spoke about in the beginning in Nigeria is not class neutral, right? And I want to, maybe later on in the discussion, I'd like to pick that up. When you say the violence that has been in a response to people's struggles in Nigeria is not class neutral, let's explore that a little further, right? I want to move on so that we have the benefit in the first phase of having all the perspectives in the room before we open it up to the audience. So in our next speaker, I'd like to introduce is Araceli Agueta. She works for the Americans, I said African, sorry, my sincere apologies. The American Friends Service Committees, and that organization works with communities worldwide to challenge injustice and build conditions for lasting peace. They are steadfast in their commitment to nonviolence and belief in the transformative power, and I love this, the transformative power of love to overcome conflict and oppression. Now, I'm hoping Comrade Soweto is listening to this. That is the belief in the transformative power of love to overcome conflict and oppression. Araceli is the Organizing and Advocacy Director for AFSC's New Jersey Immigrants' Rights Program. She's an organizer, an anthropologist, and campaigner from El Salvador. She has organized for more than 10 years across Latin America with women, youth, and indigenous people, creating tools and tactics to mobilize from different backgrounds. She has worked on gender rights, migration, environmental, and biocultural protection. Araceli has solid experience in political education, popular education, advocacy, nonviolent campaigning, and digital campaigning. She has researched social movements and political mobilization, especially on the use of language. And how powerful is that? Araceli, it is a pleasure to have you in the room, really, and we look forward to your insights. I think you know the framing, and please, let me hand over to you without any further ado. Thank you, Araceli.
Thank you, Gino. Hi, everyone. As Gino said, I'm Araceli Argueta, and I think Rada and Hassan and Gino have given amazing points to map what violence is. And I would like to emphasize right now on the symbolic representation of violence. As mentioned before on the discussion, violence is not just about physical aggression. It is structural, it is symbolic, and it is systemic, and it's an expression of power over. It operates and it is a way to justify, or it is justified by hate narratives. And those hate narratives actually shape how societies understand, but also get to legitimize harm. So violence is about control and silencing and exploitation. And in Latin America, where I come from El Salvador, this includes centuries of colonialism that imposed not only an economic and physical subjugation, but also the cultural and spiritual violence of that connection with nature and that connection with the reality. And it's displacing the ways of knowing and the ways of being. In the context of immigration, where I work right now in the US, detention centers, border walls are not just physical structures. They are potent symbols of exclusion and violence. What they are communicating is a narrative about belonging, about legality, and about power, framing that certain lives for them are expendable. And those symbols produce fear and exacerbate power. So symbolically, violence is when entire groups are stripped out of their dignity through narratives that dehumanize them. And these narratives justify the destruction of nature under the guise of progress, or the detention of families justified by the label of border security or the label of an invasion. They justify youth detention and criminalization under the label of security, as in El Salvador. And they justify a genocide under the label of self-defense, as in Gaza. So they become ways to justify harm and get society to . institutionalized violence. So policies during Bukele administration in El Salvador and Trump right now in the US exacerbated detention and turning detention centers and jails as symbols of racialized oppression. So the narratives and the images are built to control people by fear. And an example of this is a link that Daria will put in the chat that includes an image of people being deported in a military plane from the US. Actually, for the US, that plane costs $800,000 to use per every flight, while regular flights is 7 times less than that. But why they are spending that kind of money? And that is explained in the article. They said today's event, and I'm quoting, make clear that to the world that America is respected again. And that idea that they want to believe is actually creating fear. That narrative is creating fear in the immigrant communities that are trying to survive. And then it's also creating pride in the supporters. So that narrative is actually building the power that he's wanting to get. It is also important to see that in this description of narrative and violence, there are interactions, and we need to see them, because the violence that all these communities face are kind of connected by structures that explode and displace people globally, including militarization, poverty, and a lot more. One of the questions that Gino did was about countering violence. And I want to talk about that in Latin America. When we are talking about violence, we tend to talk about the 3 territories where we hold power. The first one where we hold powers is our body, ourself. The second one is the territory, the land, the nature, that is space where human interacts with life, that it's above human being, that it's nature, that it's in the rivers, that it's in whatever connects us with everything else. And the third territory is the digital and public space. So any dislegitimation, any lacking of the possibility of reclaiming any of this space is violence. I've faced them all in the context of El Salvador in the US. Incarceration, loss of agency, militarization, extractive projects destroying Latin America, the use of public and virtual space for propaganda platforms, spreading narratives of hate is violence. And I think this takes me to, it's a huge topic, understanding the symbolic representation of violence and how it actually creates and legitimizes power. But I think what is important for us is recognizing that context matter. Violence is not isolated, it's interconnected. Understanding our stories of colonialism, capitalism, patriarchy is critical for addressing the roots of violence. And symbols of resistance are powerful. Resistance is not just about action, it's about reclaiming our identities and our narratives, because the rituals, the art, our stories remind our humanity and give that humanity that it's being removed from people and from all of us. Care for ourselves, we must create the spaces for healing and for solidarity. And we must remember that joy is also a something for resistance. It's an act of resistance. And solidarity across borders, violence that doesn't know borders, neither should our solidarity. Environmental struggle, immigration struggle, gender, racial, liberation struggle are deeply connected. So for me, it's about territory, life, and freedom. In Spanish, vida, territorio, y libertad. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Araceli. That was really fantastic. And as you were speaking, I couldn't help but remember all the gallant struggles that the people of, particularly of Central America, have waged over many, many decades. And when we're thinking about from the institutionalization of peace, and I suppose mediation of violence that was coming from Rada. And then, of course, when we're looking at Hassan, and he speaks about violence is not class neutral, and what you speak about now, and that is the root causes. If we start to look at the violence that was that we see both from a collective perspective, and you raised the issue of self. I appreciate that, but also, you know, the legacy of colonialism, capitalism, and patriarchy. So we have the three dimensions, if you like, the enemy, if you like, you know, that we face, and the challenges that we, you know, that we confront in speaking about peace. The three spheres that you referred to of self, the territory, yeah, the territory of self, the person, I think the land as territory, and then the third one was the most interesting, public and digital spaces. And I think that's where, at a global level, beyond Central America, if you like, beyond the people of Central America, this is where we're seeing another form of violence, cyberbullying, hate speech, and all of those kinds of things. So I mean, very, very interesting. Thank you so much to all three of our panelists for bringing your own unique insights on the one hand, but also I see so much that we can merge and synthesize, and have another week-long discussion about, you know, the nature of the problem that we confronted with. So thank you so much. From the chat box thus far, right? The one that I have is the question. The first question I'd like to put, right, and this is not in any particular order, but just quick responses from the panelists before we open it up into the floor, and that is, you know, in navigating, in building new societies, right? In the struggle to build new societies for ourselves, you know, how do we ensure that we do not snap back or slowly devolve into older ways of being, so to speak? And this question is from Lynette Kimati. So I'm not sure if the panelists got that. Let me put it again. How do we build new societies for ourselves that do not snap back and revert to us, I suppose, into old ways of being? Anyone would like a stab at that particular question? Please come in, brother.
So my answer is only about India. And I find that it's an absolutely brilliant question, because what we are facing right now is in fact a reversion, perhaps not simply to old ways, but a reversion to hatred and violence of a sort that we have not seen since immediately after independence. I have been asking myself exactly that question, that if we have, as I hope we will, a new wave of democracy to overthrow the kind of autocracy that we currently live in, what is it that we would like a new democratic government to do to ensure that we don't slip back into autocracy again? Obviously, certain things are given. One must work towards egalitarianism. You cannot have true peace in a highly unequal society. That is fundamental and number one. But in our country, and I think perhaps this goes to Araceli's point, we also face a great deal of what is called social discrimination, which is not always economic. It has a partly economic base, but it also has an urban versus rural component, and old rich versus rising aspirations, old elites versus new elites, layer after layer after layer of patterns of inequality and discrimination. And obviously that has to be the first thing that needs to be tackled. Now, how do you do that in such a way that it can't be overturned? What we have seen is almost all our institutions have crumbled under a determined onslaught from ruling political elites. these were institutions that are protected by law. Trade unions, for example, freedom of association, for example, independent media, for example, an independent judiciary. All of these are actually protected by law, but somehow those laws haven't worked, which comes right back in a cyclical way, to the point that until you have an egalitarian society, you are not going to be able to tackle any of the other problems, including the problem of institutionalizing rights, human rights.
Yeah. No, I mean, that is so well said, right? Because we're dealing with a dichotomy, right? You spoke about the institutionalization of peace, right? And then, of course, Hassan and Araceli speaks about the institutionalization of violence. And of course, you also touch on it. So we're dealing with the dichotomy of the two, right? Let me offer, thank you for that, rather. Let me offer Hassan, Araceli, any responses to that question about in building the new, how do we ensure or avoid slipping back into the old? I think that's the basis of the question. Hassan, would you like to come in on that very briefly, comrade, please?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's a very important question. And I think it speaks to the program of our struggle and what aims are we fighting for. If we are fighting to change society within the parameters of capitalism, we're not going to be able to surmount the contradictions of the present times. Because what is fundamentally wrong with society is a class division and exploitation. Once that is done away with, it's become easier to solve other problems. And I'll give you the example of Nigeria. Nigeria is known to be a country riven by ethnic and religious division. But when you scratch the surface of it, you are going to see that it is simply a case of the ideology of the ruling class being the ideology of the entire society. Otherwise, left to ordinary working class people, they are more united by their collective experience of exploitation. And that is why during general strikes and mass protests in Nigeria, you see very interesting pictures of united effort of Nigerian people from a different part of the country, regardless of their religion or their ethnicity, but coming together in struggle. So solidarity is possible, but we have not realized it only because the system remains. So I think therefore, I think what we need to fight for is a program of struggle that recognizes the need to overthrow capitalism and to do away with class division, and a program for a new society based on the common exploitation of the resources and the wealth, and on that basis, creating a socialist state that is based on the democratic involvement of everyone. On the basis of that kind of a program, it can be possible to begin to resolve all of the problems that we have. I'm not saying that problems will disappear overnight. For instance, in Nigeria, if the working class takes power, and I think that speaks for every part of Africa, for instance, we would have to first deal with all of the crises done to us by colonialism. Because right now, you have the borders of the entire Africa, determined just for the purpose of collective plunder. And that has divided people in different ways. And it has created over the decades a collective sense of a conflict and all of that, which will take time to deal with. But what we socialists always say is that where the economic base of society is commonly owned on a democratic basis, it makes it easier for every other contradiction society to be easily resolved, because the economic contradiction is the fundamental, and it's on that basis that all other crises are based.
Okay, comrade, that is excellent, right? I'm going to pick up something, and that is the burning question about building, building something from within. I think building peace, within the framework of violence, within the violence of the system of capitalism that you have, or within the violence of the system that you might have in Nigeria, right? But certainly the issue, and that is, even if you achieve uhuru in Nigeria, what about your neighbors in Ghana and so on, right? You still remain isolated. So the point that you make about nation states, I think, is very interesting from a peace building perspective. Araceli, any thoughts on not reverting to the old as we build the new?
Sure. I think probably not like the whole way path, but something to begin with. And I will talk it on what Hassan said is solidarity. We need to build communities and we need to start understanding ourselves and the communities that we are building it. We need to bring responses, theories, ideas that are shaped on community values and on collective values. I think other part of it is love, like actually building towards love, towards understanding that we are different, and that difference is actually bringing uh, more interactive ideas and more solutions to the table instead of actually those difference being the cause of harm. And there is something that I do a lot, and I think we need to do in order to not re fall into the old is question our complicity. Like how complicit are we in different spaces, but also question this idea of the the ends justified the means, but actually
Correct.
the question should be who and what justifies the means.
Mm.
Yeah. And then the last one, I think one idea that I really keep in my mind is that we need to start listening carefully to those people that wisely stay in silence, because the ones who speak the most are the ones that are spreading the narratives of hate.
Absolutely. And is it possible, though? And this is an open question. Is it possible that the peace camp, if you like, is the 99%, and the warlords reside in the 1%? Is that possible in the way that we are speaking? That is, and I'm using these numbers, just in an arbitrary way, but it's very likely that the majority, the overwhelming majority of people want, of course, peace. They want it accompanied with justice. And when there's justice and there's peace, there's dignity. Those are the kind of preconditions of what we can call peaceful societies. But those things don't come without struggle, right? So it's not going to be handed onto a plate. So that requires work. It's painstaking work, as I said at the beginning. That is, to build those things, it's long, hard, painstaking work. And to convince people that there are indeed alternatives is the hard work of organizers, educators, activists, and so on, right? Is that right? And I'm sure, most of the panelists will agree with that approach,
Yeah.
right? Um, yeah, maybe what I'd like to do, if you don't mind, our chat box, it's very active. What I'd like, perhaps Daria, if you can help me, or any one of my team, is to just come in, if you don't mind. I can't follow everything on the chat box, but there's some really useful stuff. My yeah, my cursor is not working as effectively as I would like it to work. Sorry, the mouse. So if Daria or Peter or Joseph, any one of you could come in, or Phil, if you're still with us, Phil, please do come in and perhaps, just highlight the key questions that's emerging in the chat box. We've got about 25 minutes left in the webinar, so I'd like us the opportunity to deal with what we can as quickly as we can before we run out of time. Anyone? Joseph, would you be able to help us, please?
Sure, Gino. The chat box is quite live, and there's a lot of interaction happening over here, and a lot of very evocative and sensitive sharing that people have done. There's just one conversation which is happening. In fact, I think Sandeep had sort of raised this whole issue about, about talking about peace within the system, within
Yeah.
an imperialist dominated system, what are the ways in which one can sort of work? I mean, the whole dichotomy, and that I think Hassan has also spoken about, but that's one of the issues that we could have a conversation on.
Okay. Is there anything else, Joseph, in the chat box that we could pick up right now? So, yeah, building peace from within the system, I think we can touch on that. I would, there are many areas that will be covered in other webinars, right? So I'm just thinking about going back to the issue of violence and how do we create an effective counter, if you like, to those who are violent. Is there something called street justice, that we could speak about, where people themselves are able to reclaim the streets, from the thugs, as it were. This is something where people themselves are agents of peace, and peace is not an imposition from the top. Any thoughts on that?
This is a comment made by Zoraida, who had unfortunately had to leave, and she was just wanting to us to reflect on this issue about, she's quoting Paulo Freire, where she says violence is initiated by those who oppress, who exploit, who fail to recognize others as people, not by those who are oppressed, exploited, and unrecognized. Her reflection is, it's when the oppressed answer back that it is called violence, and some believe, in this kind of narrative. So she's wanting us to reflect on, I think, what Araceli had also spoken about, the narratives of violence.
Yeah, yeah. Araceli, can I hand over to you for a few minutes, just to reflect on that, right? And the question I suppose we could pose, or we should be posing, is, the idea that the state has the monopoly of violence, right? We're seeing more and more that the state is outsourcing that monopoly of violence to private capital, private security companies, and so on. But anyway, let me not dwell on that particular issue further. Over to you, Araceli.
And I will say capital and companies are in control of violence and using governments to legitimize that violence because of their interests. They are together by their interests. I think she was saying in the chat that my invitation is to think about if the resistance, whatever method is used, should be considered as violence. And I don't think resistance should be considered as violence. We are immersed in scenarios where violence becomes everyday basis narrative, and it's actually built by the government saying everyday words, statements, pictures, images that dehumanize the other, that dehumanize the oppressed. And self-defense, resistance will never be considered violence. In my perspective, it shouldn't be. But the thing is that the narratives that actually are mainstreaming are the ones that doesn't recognize that we are also humans and that we are resisting.
Correct, correct. And in resistance, I'd like to speak about civil disobedience. And in civil disobedience, I'd like to speak about disobedience, and disobedience to capital, capitalism in particular. But let me go to India, because India taught the world, satyagraha, passive resistance. And over to you, Radha, and your thoughts on this particular issue. And that is, when the people sort of engage in acts of resistance, they are met with violence, and they are called, in these days, in our case, they were called communists, and they were labeled, they were put in prison. Today, they are called terrorists, and there are many peaceful organizations that are being labeled terrorists. So over to you, and tell us, how do we counter this narrative?
Well, in response to your earlier question, I do have a couple of examples of when we were able to take out large marches where we confronted mobs waving swords and so on, and managed to actually drive them away. We also took over police stations and rescued people and so on. But this was the 80s, when there was still some kind of social consensus against violence. That consensus is frayed now. And unfortunately, it has frayed with I would say, at least tacit encouragement from the executive, the political executive to start with, and then it filters down through to the police and so on and so forth. So it's much more difficult, I would say, today to be able to do what we were able to do in the late 70s and early 80s. The other point, I think, we forget actually to document how people are resisting violence every day. Let's put it a different way. If there wasn't resistance, I'm absolutely sure that the levels and scale of violence would have risen so sharply that they would threaten to engulf our country. But they haven't engulfed our country despite 10 years and actually a much longer history of attempts to politically provoke violence. So, the interesting question is, how do we map daily resistance in daily life? It is even today a common story that neighbors will take in threatened minority neighbors at times when they feel that there is a danger of violence against them. Not all neighbors, but the fact is that some will. And as I said, that my small mountain town has very successfully resisted attempts. The South, on the whole, is far less prone to communal violence than the North is. And it's also less prone to political violence, which the East has. So what is it in the nature of this? And you come back to that here the political leadership has used the executive or the state, if you like to call it that, to actually try to institute some level of egalitarianism, some basic welfare where everyone has healthcare, everyone has education, and everyone has at least enough food to eat. That has helped develop civic values uh, uh, in those areas, which do manage to resist pressure. The question for us as activists is, what can we do to highlight how much people are resisting every day, and B, how do we manage to come together in a movement that can actually claim some incremental successes, step by step. And we haven't yet beaten that problem. I was thinking about it in terms of the Indian freedom movement, which actually I feel we need to consider as a liberation movement more than as an independence movement. And I think we made a mistake in thinking of it as a nationalist movement and not a liberation movement. It should have been far wider, far more inclusive, and far more grounded in the kind of thing Gandhi did. He did succeed in actually taking a very unequal society in which oppression was far more prevalent than it is today. And yet he managed to bring classes and groups of people together to aspire for better conditions and to actually fight for those better conditions. And it comes to this narrative question. One of the really interesting things about our liberation movement was that different groups of people invented it the way they wanted. And nobody said to them, no, you can't do that. Actually, it was very welcome to have different interpretations of what freedom and liberation meant in different areas and parts of the country. That's what gave it its dynamism and its strength.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Radha. I want to move to Hassan and bring Hassan, Hassan, strategic objectives of your work in Nigeria, right? And given the fact that you are confronted by a hostile state, as it were, not for the first time, that is. And the issue, though, and in what you were saying, no one can argue that the struggle, Amilcar Cabral says, we must the enemy economy says those
I
who
missed
organize.
a bit of it. I missed some part of your question. I don't know.
So
Yes,
okay,
no,
my apologies.
you're on
It's
mic time.
Okay, right? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, no.
Gino, please
Okay,
go ahead.
right. So the
We can hear you.
question,
Gone again.
those, oh no. Should I?
Maybe type it in and Joseph can read it.
Yeah, okay. Joseph, can you do the quote of Martin Luther King? Those who organize for peace must do so as effectively as those who organize for war. And I'm throwing this specifically at Hassan. For if you can do it in Nigeria, and my dear comrade, we will all emulate you.
Yes, I mean, I think I got the gist of the question now, and thanks you very much. I mean, the thing is that I think we need to first recognize that in the struggle we are waging, it is not only the working class, the youth, that determines the forms of engagement. The forms and the tempo and the character of engagement is mutually determined by both classes in opposition. So that from that point of view, it's impossible to therefore say that a particular class can insist that we are going to just adopt a non-violent form of struggle, regardless of what happens. I think how the question is posed in Nigeria, and this was posed, for instance, in the uprising in 2012 January, and it's been posed several times after that. And it is that at what point, especially when struggle develops to a point where power is lying on the street, what are the programs for the working class and the youth in struggle? What are the programs? What programs do they require to be able to move from defensive protest action to taking measures of supplanting the current way society is organized? And that question, the working class in Nigeria has not been able to answer it. And that is because of the character of the trade unions and all of that. I can't go into all of that. But what we Marxists have always posed is that there's a need for a mass workers' party, like something that can act like the general staff for the working class, with a leadership, a bold leadership, and a clear program that can unite the economic struggle with the political struggle. And from that point of view, the question of how the different movements of the struggle in the industrial sector, in the communities and in the countryside, how they can come together into a powerful movement that can begin to pose the question of power much more clearly, that can be made possible. Without that, what we have seen in Nigeria, for instance, and I can assume that that is the case in most countries in Africa, is that economic struggles get to a point because of the weakness of the capitalist states in the neo-colonial world, that after a few days of protest or strikes, the state are suspended in the air. But because the leadership of the struggle does not have a program of what needs to be done to then take power, then nothing happens. Then the capitalist state takes the initiative. And what they therefore do is to launch full-scale repression, send the army to the street, So that in that sense, we have to recognize, therefore, for those who are peace builders or peace promoters and peace actors,
Okay.
that just like the climate question, the fastest way to prevent more bloodshed and more violent society, just as the fastest way.
Thank you so much, Comrade. There's so much of wisdom.
Excuse me. Please go on.
But thank you, Comrade. We have a little bit of a problem with the connectivity here, right? Am I right?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm struggling to hear you as well.
Are you hearing Comrade Hassan?
We can hear you well now, Gino. Please continue.
Okay. So maybe Comrade, yeah, okay, let us pause there. What I was saying, I was picking up earlier, Comrade, and that is that we, in the construction of the state, we see the army, we see the police, we see all the security apparatus, if you like, the intelligence at work, right? So in the way that we constructed this state, earlier when you speak about institutionalization, part of the institutionalization of peace, rather, is that we created an army, we created police, all kinds of police and so on, but we haven't that institutionalized peace as such, right? So I think we're dealing with problems of the constructions of state. And I'm being a bit intimidated because the way you're looking at me says that you are not hearing me. Is that correct?
No, I heard you. I heard in the beginning, it was it went for a second or two, but I heard what you said.
But I still struggle to hear Gino. I'm not able to hear you, but it's okay.
Sorry. Listen, my apologies. I came here, and this is the Action Aid officers in South Africa. This is where I came here hoping to run away from problems of internet connectivity. But anyway, Phil is right. We are dealing with problems of capitalism here. So what I want to do, we've got a few 6 minutes left, right? So I was just thinking about what this tells us from a violence perspective. Let's revisit the nature of the state, because what was in the chat box was that we have an army, we have a police. I mean, even our own government. South Africa is not at war with anyone, but we have a Department of Defense that's always saying they are under-resourced, keep losing wars, but yet, their budgets are increasing. So money gets diverted to security instead of other instruments of peace, if you like. So that's something certainly I would like to pick up, as we're moving forward. What kind of state that we built? What is the nature of what we call the democratic state, right? That's one question I would like to sort of pick up to. I'm afraid we've only got 5 minutes left. This has been such an absorbing discussion. Obviously, the limitations of time means that we have to continue these discussions in so many different ways. I'm hoping that you're going to be staying with us for the rest of the webinars, right? Because you've shared so much with us. And of course, we've also got other speakers that are present here. And I saw Philippe. They are coming in next in webinar 2. So this is a great way. You don't lose your kind of rich experiences by you zooming in one webinar and then zooming out the next webinar, right? So hopefully you'll stay with us. What I'd like to do then, Daria, would you please come in and just help me conclude this section by referring to the kind of resources that were shared. There was a request, Daria, that I've seen in the chat box to say how can we sort of collectivize and socialize the links and resources that were posted onto the chat box. Daria, can you help us on that one?
Sure. Everyone who has signed up will be receiving an email following with the recording, as well as a summary of the webinar, any links that were shared, and any other notes that our panelists would like to share with those in attendance. So keep an eye on your email.
Okay. Okay, and certainly in terms of the questions, isn't that so, Daria and Phil, that all those questions would not get lost, that we'll find ways of picking them up and running with other webinars so that no important issues get lost in the process, right? And we will try to manage those. And you will see it in the recording, you will see it in future notes, in future publications that Thomas will be working on, that those kinds of issues do not get lost. We're very interested to make sure that we do not lose any of the important points, that you made up, okay? There's your feedback. Feedback loops are very important. This is only the first webinar, so please, can we ask participants to fill in your answers, because that will help the organizing team to improve as we go along, right? And the next webinar is going to be on the 6th of February. And in that webinar, we're going to be focusing on in another land war, in another's land, war and militarization. In this webinar, we'll explore the historical and contemporary dynamics of war, militarization, and external aggression in global geopolitics, focusing on how power struggles continue to threaten world peace. Now, everything that you've said today can also feed into that particular discussion, if you realize. But also, we will have a focus on the global arms trade to understand the nexus of wealth accumulation and state power, right? So we're hoping that you will be able to join us, right? And I thought in the final sort of minute that we have, there's something I would like, irrespective of the violence that we are confronted with. There's a quote, it's a mantra that I'll share with you. It's from Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn fought the Nazis in World War II, but when he came back, he became an organizer of dock workers in New York. And that's why I like him, because he started organizing in the labor movement, right? And he says, to be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic. It is based on the fact that human history is a history not only of cruelty, but also of compassion, sacrifice, courage, and kindness. What we choose to emphasize in this complex history will determine our lives. If we only see the worst, it destroys our capacity to do something. If we remember those times and places, and there are so many, where people have behaved magnificently, this gives us the energy to act, and at least the possibility of sending this spinning top of a world in a completely different direction. And if we do act in however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. The future is an infinite succession of presents. And to live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is in itself a marvelous victory. So I will send this quote to the organizing team, and certainly that I hope that we can reflect on Howard Zinn's ground us, that we have the capacity, the future can be an infinite succession of presents. So finally, allow me to thank you all, the participants, and for all your engagements on the chat box. Thank you very, very much for being here. We hope to see you next time. To our panelists, really thank you very much for your insights. You gave us so much food for thought that certainly 90 minutes, obviously, was never going to be enough. But thank you so much for helping us managing the time. And yeah, and to my team, look forward to seeing you again. Really, it's been great. Thank you for this webinar series. So my dear comrades and colleagues, let me say, till we meet again, peace be unto you. Thank you and goodbye.